Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar this afternoon to discuss the Department of Community's financial assumptions for the commissioning of out-of-home care services. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mark Burgess, Executive Director Strategy, and I have been the project lead on the work so far. And I would like to acknowledge the fact I'm joined here by Amber Fabry, who is the newly appointed Executive Director of the Specialist Child Protection Unit, and Amber and I will be working on this important work moving forward. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the fact that we are currently sitting on Wajak Noongar Budja and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land from which I am joining you from, as well as the traditional custodians of the land throughout Western Australia, and recognise their continuing connection to their lands, families and communities. And I pay my deep respects to their elders past and present. I would firstly like to thank you all for your ongoing engagement and support of the commissioning of out-of-home care services. I'm pleased that we are almost at the tender stage of the process, and I look forward to progressing this with you. I'd also like to thank the advocacy provided by your peak bodies, by CAFWA, the Noongar Family Safety Wellbeing Council and WACOS, who have requested this session to be held to ensure service providers, new and old, are appropriately equipped to participate in the tender process. Also joining Amber and I today is Community's Chief Financial Officer, Michael Cravola, who will be with us imminently. He will just be here in a matter of minutes. And Principal Management Accountant, Amar Al-Saeg, who will lead the discussion around the financial assumptions that the Department of Communities has indicated costings for so far. As always, I encourage you to ask any questions in the chat box. However, in response to the feedback I have received, I will be keeping track of the questions and asking them in real time where appropriate. So whilst we will be leaving some questions till the end, I will try as much as possible to ask relevant questions as Amar and Michael are presenting their PowerPoint slides. Apologies, I was trying to keep COVID safe by keeping my mask off, and I do hear that I'm a little bit muffled. Any other questions will be answered during the question time and question and answer session, which will be towards the end of the presentation. The questions will only be moderated to ensure that there are no double ups, and any questions we do not get to today will be answered and published on our website. I would also like to encourage you to like any questions and that appear in the chat, as this will assist us in prioritising the questions we answer today. We are committed to continuing our open communication with you all, so if there are any questions that are not addressed in this session, please do not hesitate to contact us. And just as I said, he would be here imminently. I would also like to welcome our Chief Financial Officer, Michael Cravola, who has joined us. Welcome, Michael.
All right, thanks, Mark.
And I would say that we are committed to continue our open conversation with you all. So if there are any questions that are not addressed in this session, please do not hesitate to contact us. Now, before I ask Community's Chief Financial Officer to present today, he's asked that the following disclaimer be made clear. And you'll see this up on your screens now, but I do want to read through it so everyone is on the same page. Communities continues to be committed to open communication with the sector throughout this process to ensure the best outcomes for children and young people in out-of-home care. This presentation has been prepared by the Department of Communities in good faith and represents general background information about out-of-home care at the date of this presentation. The information in this presentation is provided in summary form only and is neither comprehensive nor complete. This presentation does not contain all information that is or may be material to providers or potential providers and should not be considered as advice or a recommendation to providers or potential providers. The information does not take into account any provider's particular objectives, financial situations or needs. By attending the presentation or by reading the presentation slides, you agree to observe the following: that this presentation has been made solely for information purposes. This presentation may be amended and supplemented as community sees fit and should not be relied upon for the purpose of entering into any commissioning of services. All projections, valuations and statistical analysis are for general information only. They may be based on subjective assessments and assumptions and may use one among alternative methodologies that produce different results. To the extent data are based on historical information, these should not be relied upon as an accurate prediction of future performance. Any financial data in these presentations are solely information as background to communities and should not be relied upon for the purposes of entering into any commissioning. And the financial information set out in this presentation is based on assumptions and adjustments and does not purport to represent the results of operations on an audited basis or what operations will be in future periods. Furthermore, no representations is made regarding the reasonableness of assumptions made in this presentation or accuracy or completeness of any modelling, scenario analysis or backtesting. The information in this presentation is not intended to predict actual results and no assurances will be given with respect thereto. None of communities, its advisors, connected persons or any other persons accepts any liability whatsoever for any loss, however, so arising directly or indirectly from this presentation or its contents. All information, opinions and estimates contained herein are given as of the date hereof and are subject to change without notice. So with that being said, and thank you for the honour of reading that disclaimer out, I would like now to introduce Michael Cravola, the Chief Financial Officer, to take us through the financial side of things in today's webinar.
Thanks, Mark. I guess you can't half tell that I used to work in financial services, right? But with a disclaimer like that. Hey, I'm really excited because I'm an accountant to be talking finances with you guys today. So I look at it two ways. It's either a great opportunity for the part of the room to get about 30 minutes of nap time in, or for the real numbers boffins like myself, it's really an exciting 30 minutes that you'll join me for. What we're really talking about today is in case basically 4 or 5 major topic areas. You know, why are we here? We'll talk about the funding analysis. We're going to talk about, well, are we getting more or are we getting less? And we want to talk about funding flexibility in the model going forward. And then the key takeaways. Look, ultimately, the point of today is really just to give you our thinking about how we thought we would allocate places, for want of a better word, across the 4 or 5 sort of services types, and our thinking behind how we would allocate our money that we're spending with the sector across the various service types. My expectation is that you guys are actually going to go away and you're going to think about the services you want to offer, whether you want to play in each one of these service types, or if you have an alternative service model that you might think is applicable to this sort of activity, and you will run your own pricing models, and that will come up with what you're going to put into your tenders going forward. And we'll talk about the tender process towards the back end of this presentation. So fundamentally what we're talking about here is what assumptions, what parameters we have used when we've been talking about out-of-home care and how we might, buy places in each of the 4 service care types. And we've also assumed what those sort of service prices have been based on a sort of our estimate of what the cost structure might look like. Again, we're talking about these things. We're talking about there's an annual funding. We've then worked out what the price per care type might look like. We said, okay, how does that relate to the need assessment tool? We then looked at, okay, the care assessment support cost, how does that play into these service types? And then ultimately, what does all this look like when you put it all together in terms of an overall annual spend in each of those sorts of service types per care or per carer place? So ultimately, the real point about it is we're trying to allocate $130 million across, that we have next year into the various block funding sorts of approaches we've got going forward. So that represents effectively an additional $23 million that we're putting into the sector in this financial year. And really about what we're trying to look at is how do we move from our current block funding sort of approach, which has been old and existing and possibly doesn't hit the objectives we want it to hit going forward, into the new model that we've all agreed is the model we want to try to build into the future. So if we look at the next slide, we had $107 million, which is sort of what we spent last year, roughly across 249 services. So it's basically comprised of about $42 million worth of individualised contracts. That's something where we specifically done something, contract for a specific service type with you guys. And then we've also got block funding grants and service agreements, which make about 61% of the spend. So we're looking about, okay, how is this going to work going forward in the new way of working? So it's a busy slide. I don't intend to go through each individual number on it, but this is the general thought process that we've gone through in coming up with each one of these, our cost structure for each one of these care packages. So effectively, as you're aware, there's 4 types of service, and we're talking the short-term care, the group care, the foster care, the complex care sides of things, and the price differential across those areas really relates to 2 things. You either have price per carer, so in the foster care and complex care, it's a price per place. In short-term and group care, it's really a price per house or facility. As a result, we have looked at how we're doing these things slightly differently. So again, when we talk about the group care and the short-term care, we've built in lease costs, we've built in house operation costs. Intention is not necessarily that we'll be providing houses for those sorts of group arrangements where we may indeed, but we're generally expecting people to provide their own sort of places through lease arrangements. We've made allocations for that in terms of the funding that we would expect to see coming, or the pricing that we would expect to see, forming part of your pricing model when we see it at tender time. If we move on to the next slide, we'll just jump into this sort of what our assumptions underlying the short-term care is. So we've got about generally 6 or so assumptions across 3 or 4 different dimensions, as you can see on the slide. Basically, we've broken the dimensions to staffing, the operation of the house, the placement costs, and then the case support costs at the end of it, or children's support costs. Ultimately, children's support costs are really related to what do we need to provide for the child's care in terms of, general consumables, for want of a better word, school books, equipment, CPI growth associated with those sorts of things, because it's going to be a long-term sort of placement. When in terms of staffing, we're also talking about it. We're looking at one primary carer, one secondary carer, and one support worker. We've allowed for an ERO in addition to what's already been included, though ultimately we would not expect there to be EROs going forward. We would expect that the prices that come out of this tender process are going to be all-in prices and look at it for the term of the contract, which will be a 5-year sort of contract. So you guys will have to build in your own estimates of inflation, staff costs and all the rest when you come up with your pricing model. We've also assumed that there will be some other allowances associated with having, swinging people in and out to provide a sort of cover for time off for the various care arrangements as well. And ultimately, we're not assuming that there will be overtime included in this model at all, because you're assuming that, in terms of this overall cost structure, that we've managed our rosters appropriately and efficiently. And again, in the house operational things, we're trying to allocate exactly how much it costs to run sort of a care house, and therefore compensate you for those sorts of things. Again, ultimately, that will be driven by how you guys want to set up your care arrangements going forward when you put your bids in. So we move on to the next one, and we can talk about group care. And I think fundamentally it's a similar sort of thought process we adopted when we came up with this sort of pricing sort of assumption. We tried to build out the cost stack, but the main difference is how we've applied the CASC sort of model. So again, the CASC model really is talking about, okay, what is the individual need of the client, of the child in care, and what sort of costs do we need to sort of facilitate looking after that child. So as you guys are aware, a NAT level 1 needs assessment, our needs assessment tool, which I think has been developed in conjunction with the sector, will assign a level of care between 1 and 5, 5 being most complex, 1 being a relatively easy child. Not that any child is particularly easy, I just ask my own kids that. But effectively, what we're trying to do there is to make sure there's enough sort of funding available depending on the needs of the child that we can ultimately compensate for in that sort of group care environment. And again, ultimately, what we're trying to provide is a bucket of money that look after the group care arrangements in situ. And if children move between the various NAT levels and all the rest of it, that will be subject to review. but ultimately the idea is that people will be in place and able to stay in that sort of place over time, and you don't have to move them around as the net levels change.
Can I just jump in? I've got a couple of questions that probably relate to some of the discussion at the moment. So can you just clarify, does the primary carer and secondary carer refer to a staff member or a foster carer?
So look, I think it can be either in that regard. I mean, depending on the care type, we've sort of just made an assumption that, you know, there'll be a care worker associated with that care facility, or couple of care workers associated with that care facility. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, one particular type or another. And ultimately, it's up to how you guys want to staff your facilities as to how you price those costs in. But generally speaking, we've tried to say there's going to be a couple of people involved, and we've made some assumptions around the Commonwealth Award. So effectively, we're trying to get to you know, what's a reasonable amount of salaries and wages that you would expect to come through in the pricing model.
And just on staffing and so forth, because there is another question relating to that. Has the cost of rostering on 8-hour shifts rather than 12 hours, and what level of staffing under the SACS award? So the question is around the rostering, I suppose, assumption. Was that based on 8 hours or 12 hours when that was made?
Yeah, so I think we made it, we've sort of said it's basically, we've assumed an 8 hours rostered model in the assumptions pages. So, and again, ultimately that's the decision as to you guys when you're setting up your bid as to, you know, how you expect to run your teams.
Yeah. Okay, we'll keep going. Sorry, I'll come back in shortly.
All right, so if we move on to the next one, foster care. So again, this is a relatively, I guess, simple sort of approach. We've looked at, you know, it's different obviously from the group care arrangements because we're talking about, okay, how we go about getting kids to the foster carers. So there's, you know, administration costs, there's breaks, there's, you know, placement referral sorts of costs that we're sort of trying to build out. Case management costs we try to include in what we're calling the placement costs element. And then obviously there's the cost of looking after the children, which are, you know, in the next two sorts of columns. And one is more about the physical bits and pieces versus the, you know, everyday running expenses for child, so to speak, of food, transport, recreation sorts of things. So we've tried to estimate all of those things and sort of provide a sort of general level of funding for each foster care sort of placement. Combined with this again is the needs analysis tool. So again, we're trying to, you know, weight the children that the foster carers will be looking at and providing funding for, depending on, you know, how much care we expect them to need. So effectively, again, the NAT level 1 is going to be a relatively easy child to look after versus the NAT level 5, which require quite intensive care and support services as we go through this, as they go through this sort of process of being looked after. One point, I guess, in that one is we have also made the assumption that there is, when we talk about placement costs, we've allowed for a short break as well in there for the carer as well. So it's not all, you know, got to be 24/7 in that. There is opportunity for some breaks for the carers. And then again, I guess ultimately the final one, in terms of how we looked at it, is complex care arrangements. But now, in terms of the assumptions around this is obviously going to vary very differently. And we don't think we've got this right by any way, stretch or form. We've tried to come up with what we thought was a simple model, but again, ultimately I stress that, you know, you guys who are, you know, experts in the field will have your own pricing models as to how you're going to deal with the complex care arrangements and what needs to be taken into account. Again, we've looked at primary carers, one support worker. We've assumed is sleepover, on-call and other allowances. We have assumed in this case that there is overtime. We looked at the group home arrangements before. We didn't assume there was overtime. We've assumed that there's likely to be casual cover for the two primary care workers, so it becomes more of a 24/7 sort of arrangement. And we've made assumptions around pay point being, you know, Commonwealth Award with the potentially with the arrow loaded into it. Again, house operational costs, lease, you know, food, etc. All the costs associated with running a complex care facility we've estimated and put in that house operational bucket. And again, we've also looked at the administrative costs, case management costs, placement referrals as part of our placement costs again. And ultimately, sorry, just go back one. And again, we haven't looked at the CASC in the complex care arrangements, and we'll sort of get into that sort of later as to why we haven't looked into that. But effectively, we have looked at the general sort of maintenance in terms of schooling, extracurricular fees, case support costs related to the individual child in complex care. Sorry for that. Thanks, Nikki. So look, ultimately, how do we use all this information? So the need assessment tool data, which is sort of undertaken between ourselves and the sector, the participant that we're looking to place the child with, all that data gets basically pulled together through a series of questionnaires, and I'm sure there are people in this room that know this system way better than me, but ultimately that's how I understand it work. We then crunch it through our proprietary trademark model, which I'm not sure it's not like that at all, but there is a model which we feed this all through. And at the end of the day, it will throw out the amount of dollars that are associated with the needs arrangements of that individual child. And I guess what I really want to stress here, the CASC dollar numbers are variable costs associated with the needs of the child, whereas ultimately what we're trying to come up with is, there's a funding arrangement which will give you most of your funding, which will be the block funding arrangements, and that's somewhere around about 70% or 80% of the funding, and about 20% of the funding or thereabouts is going to be variable, and that's going to be dependent on the needs of the child. Ultimately, the needs to assessment tool, I'm sure everyone aware, identifies the behavioural and special needs of the children in care and rates the complexity of their needs. And so, as you can sort of see on that chart, we have estimated, based on the funding that we've got available, what the numbers in each one of those buckets are going to likely to be in terms of care arrangements. Again, we are looking at this data to work out how many places we can afford to buy for the amount of dollars that we've sort of got. That will be driven by what comes out of the tender process. So again, ultimately, if we're wildly off in terms of our assumptions and you have either very expensive or very cheap sort of services compared to our sort of assumptions, then we'll either be able to buy more places or less places, depending on the outcomes of the tenders. Okay, so if we just pause for a second here, this is just generally an outwork of how the CASC model sort of is going to work in terms of the variability of funding arrangements. So if we look at the sort of the top one for me, which is NAT level 2, what we're saying there is the child or young person's behaviour shows above average indicators from the model, which means they're going to get slightly more than a child or young person in our level 1, which is behaviours within the usual range for that sort of child. So the idea, I guess, ultimately is that the NAT level 1 provides you with a child that's basically just needs to be looked after and provided with the usual sorts of supports all the way. So as you start going up the NAT levels, then this requires more interventions and more supports and whatever shape or form those sorts of things take. And ultimately, when you get to 5, and we've said this a couple of times, the child has complex or extremely complex needs that will have a significant impact on multiple areas of functioning and how they integrate with society. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to achieve when we look at the NAT levels. Okay, if we move on to the next one. So ultimately, how does that all play out? We've sort of tried to give an idea of what the CASC sort of services might be required in terms of pulling these things together. So again, we've had a look at the various sort of services that we've seen from our own history of operating these sorts of things and allocated costs across the various NAT levels to say, okay, well, if we were running some of these, or we have seen these sorts of services used in the past from our own experiences, and so this is how we could see it playing out as you move up the NAT tree. Ultimately, it is again down to you guys' discretion as to how you want to spend the fund, as to how you would split these variable costs up. But effectively, if you look at NAT level 5 here, we've assumed that there's a lot of carer support that's required, and hence that's what's driving the majority of the overall variable spend this level, versus and adding in the therapeutic consulting and others, therapeutic counselling, well, probably consulting as well, and other services for $11,000. So again, we've based this on our own history, but ultimately, you will be driven by how you guys see the part of how you want to build your facilities, build your bids, as to how you'll use this money going forward. All right, so
Can I just stop you there before we go any further? Because there's a couple of questions which I just want to get to as part of this. Firstly, just some clarification regarding housing properties. So the department can and has got a number of housing properties that will be provided, particularly for short-term and group care. However, we have had quite a large number of organisations approach us about utilising their own properties as part of this process. So it will be a mixed use model, but there will be properties available as well, departmental properties available for use. But just wanting to clarify that one.
I don't think we've got unlimited stock though.
We don't have an unlimited stock. If we did, there wouldn't be a social housing wait list, but there is. So just a couple of other questions. What are the in regards to the financials, and particularly around the staffing, what is the percentage of on costs that have been factored in for organisations in regards to this?
So look, I think it's fair to say we've factored in the standard on costs in terms of, superannuation, the usual. So we would expect it sort of sits around that 15% sort of mark. But again, ultimately it depends on your own, payment arrangements with your staff as to exactly what level of on costs you have when you're building out your pricing model. So again, for us, it was very much an assumption as to, what we would be using in terms of wage price points as well as the on costs associated with it.
Another question just around the staffing model, and has there been an assumption in the staffing model or that children will be at school for a specific period of day, which requires obviously less or no staffing if that was to occur?
Right. So look, again, I don't think we've literally gone into that sort of level of detail when we've come up with this. We've basically used a series of averages across the year for the amount of care hours we would expect to be put into each child. Ultimately, again, will be driven by exactly what your operating experiences are in terms of looking after children and the various children, depending on which NAT level they fall under. So ultimately, your own pricing model will drive your bid price.
Okay. All right, and then last one on just again on around some of the staffing and before we get into the NATs, because there is a couple of questions around the NATs as well, but we might just leave them for a second. We'll keep going. But the next question is, sorry, I just lost my bearings there for a second. Have you used, in regards to the salary level utilised throughout the assumptions, has it been the same salary level across all of the assumptions? So, for example, let me take an example like SACS level 3. So it's just a question: has the same level been used across all of the assumptions for the salary level of workers?
Yeah, so that's right. So the intention is that we've picked a particular point and just carried that forward across the various care arrangements.
Okay, great. All right. Now we are going into next. Sorry, I'm just hijacking your presentation around the financial analysis. So before we get to that, I might just ask. There is a couple of NAT questions which I just wanted to clarify. So there's a question here that says that talks about the NAT level 5. So the question is as to why is the NAT funding the same, not depending on what the placement option is. So if you're a NAT level 5 child but you're in foster care, or if you're a NAT level 5 child and you're in group home care, it's exactly the same, but obviously quite significantly different kind of placements. So maybe, Amber, that might be, I don't know if that's something you might be able to.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk to that in terms of, and perhaps stepping back a little bit about what the NAT is designed to do, because it actually gives us a general idea of the needs of a child and assigns a general cost figure. So it's not a tool that is designed to assess absolutely everything. I know it's called a needs assessment tool. It does not actually assess everything about the child. It's a collective cost model. and it's our attempt to assign funding to the need of the child. So I'm hoping that that does provide some overall clarity. So you would anticipate that well, let's put it, for example, that grandma is caring for 2 of her grandchildren. Those 2 children might have very, very different needs. She might have a child that is a level 1 that actually mostly is quite straightforward, doesn't have a huge amount of costs associated to them. And then she might have a very complex child in her care that has significant disabilities, for example, and might be a level 4 or a level 5 because of the costs associated to their needs. They might be in a wheelchair. You know, there might be a whole lot of costs associated to that child. So the care arrangement, it's great that they're with family, they're with Nana, but actually the costs associated to the needs of those 2 children look very different. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Thanks for that, Amber. And another question as well, which is not related to that, which is more is just about regional loading and where regional loading comes into it and how that's going to work either as part of this or as an addition to some of the costings that have been given so far.
All right, so look, I think it's fair to say we've probably worked on averages across the state. So we haven't necessarily factored in absolutely regional allowances. Having said that, it's an average, so there'll be an element of it in there. Practically speaking, again, if you're a purely regional focused business and you're looking at, and you factor in all your costs into the bid price, then obviously when we evaluate your bid price, then we'll be taking those factors into account, as long as you've spelled them out clearly in your tender documents when we make our evaluations of the bid. So again, the fact that you're in the regional and not metro shouldn't any way, shape or form preclude you from being successful in the tenders. It's just, you know, we will be evaluating the tenders on a whole range of factors as well as price, but on a whole range of factors around the service delivery history of the organisation.
All right, great. Yeah, that'll do for now. So I'll let you continue on with the funding analysis.
All right, so this slide really tries to say, okay, of the 130 packages, of the overall package of dollars we've got to spend, what does that actually translate into in terms of placements we'd be looking to buy? Ultimately, we think, based on the assumptions we've just presented, that there's about 1,000 packages, care packages that we'd be looking to buy, and they'll be roughly split into, well, obviously everyone gets the same care sort of type arrangements, but about 900 of them would be eligible for the CASC, sort of uplifts, or whatever you want to call it, but the CASC sort of money's in that as well. So practically speaking, based on these numbers we've just shown you, we would be expecting to buy about 1,000 spaces over the next year, 5 years basically. And that's our analysis of what their current funding buys. So if we go on to the next slide, then we tried to break it down also to say, okay, well, what does that mean across the various 4 care types we've got? So again, we're showing here roughly, in the short-term care, we think there's about 52 care arrangements we'd be looking to buy, and the bulk of the care arrangements will be either in group care or in foster care, and hopefully the 10% that we've got in complex care will be enough for the kids that have complex needs. So again, this is based on all of our assumptions, it's based on our current funding, and just trying to work out roughly where we expect most of the care activity to be isolated across the 4 care types. So ultimately, what we're really doing here is saying we've got an extra $23 million that we're injecting into the sector. We're trying to get the best bang for the buck. We're trying to move our cost model from what it was in the past, which was basically majorly block funded and I don't think satisfied anyone, into much more of a responsive sort of model that allows us to provide extra funding for kids that have sort of different needs as they move through the care system. Ultimately, we believe we're providing more money into the sector. We're providing a different way of allocating that money between fixed and variable components. We're providing increased funding for higher needs kids, And we're also providing more uplifts into our foster care sort of arrangements. Overall, we think this is generally a good financial model or good sort of care model that we're wanting to introduce. And so we're looking for your support as part of that. Ultimately, the success of this model will depend on the tendering process, when we will get to it in the next couple of months, as to people wanting to participate and where they want to participate. Now, if we look at the funding flexibility slide, ultimately here, we're trying to provide a system that doesn't penalise anybody for bringing a sibling group into care together and keeping them together. We're looking to provide that sort of funding flexibility, that sort of care flexibility that enables us to work best with the needs of the child and the family group and keep family groups together. We're also looking to basically provide capacity building for people if the organisations to move from the old course of care sort of arrangements into our new proposed sort of model of care arrangements going forward. And it enables us to provide partnerships to provide a better range of services to the children in care. And ultimately, I think the question has been asked, can funding be used across cohorts of children? And so look, whilst we're still looking into the numbers of all of that, and we'll be informed by the bid process, part of the tender arrangements, our sort of policy approach here, position at the moment is largely, and of course Mark will correct me if I'm wrong, that we have no particular problem if the CAS can be used across cohorts of children. It's ultimately about how we're getting funding providing for the needs of the child. But ultimately those things can change as we start to see that, as we start to do more work in those sorts of areas. All right, so for those of you who are sort of getting a little bit bored by now and starting to look for a cigarette or jelly bean or something like that, I'm only 2 slides away, so please bear with me. Look, the key takeaways really is, again, I'm probably overemphasising it, maybe you can never overemphasise it, but the ultimate idea of this entire approach is to provide a system that understands the needs of the children, provides funding based on those needs to the children, but also provides a flexible care arrangement to keep family groups together, and basically to incentivise the sector to come up with new care arrangements that might actually be better than the care arrangements that we've had in the past. And so we want the sector to experiment, want us to be able to sell, want a better word, new services to us that looks to achieve those aims of providing a better opportunity for kids that are in care across the life cycle of the children being in that care. Okay, so that's sort of the pitch for the financial part of it. There's 2 more slides. One's talking really about the at-home care commissioning cycle. So if we move on to that one. Largely the timeline, and that's probably a bit small, but largely the timeline at March is we've done all the sort of work with you guys. We've explained the systems that we're after. We've had the design labs. We've appointed Paxton as our group consultants. Effectively, they are going to help us all work through the tender arrangements and provide that extra manpower on the ground to help us go through what we expect to be quite a lot of contracting arrangements going forward. We've done some work, some information work with the ACCOs as well. And now we've brought everyone onto the same sort of page with regards to our assumptions around the number of places we think we've got money to buy and the assumed price levels of the various levels of services that we would, care types that we're likely to buy. So what's next? By the end of this month, we expect, or early next month, we expect to release the initial draft of the tender documents for feedback. There'll be a tender process, and as you're well aware, that'll take somewhere between 3 and potentially 6 months for us to go through the process of awarding tenders, evaluating or reviewing tenders, and then awarding the tenders. And so we expect that to occur around about October, with about plenty of time for contracts to be awarded ahead of existing contracts termination date. So effectively, start of a new year, 2023, we should have new contracts in place, and we're starting to move towards how do we transition from the old arrangements into the new contractual arrangements. And I think the last slide really was just a little bit of feedback for everybody here to say, okay, how many respondents have we had across the ACCO sector when we presented this at the information day for the ACCOs. But ultimately, I guess what I also wanted to make the point was that when it comes to the contracting arrangements that we're going to use going forward, we have no preconceived idea of what those contracting arrangements are going to look like. We believe we're going to be asking in our tender documents for people to bid on whether they want to provide services in 1, 2, 3, or all 4 care types. As a result, you don't necessarily have to be an expert in those care types. If you want to be part of a consortium, or if you want to pull together consortiums to bid on particular ranges of services based on region, based on care services, we are open to all sorts of structures that people want to have. And ultimately too, if you feel that you guys aren't the best at administration and you want to bring admin companies along as part of your consortium, we're absolutely open to that as well. There's not going to be a high hurdle in terms of getting your bids in terms of how we evaluate them. What we're really trying to do is get the best level of service that we possibly can for the kids in our sort of care at the most appropriate price. So again, we're open to different forms of groupings of service providers working together to provide the levels of services that are required. Obviously, we have to fit those within the overall tender rules, because I can sort of sense my procurement people sort of edging towards me with knives, but ultimately we will be reasonably flexible in how we evaluate some of these things going forward within our overall tender procurement sorts of rules.
Thanks, Mac. And I suppose we've spoken about on a number of occasions previously about the direct approach procurement, the direct procurement approach for Aboriginal community controlled organisations, and continuing to ensure we try and drive that forward. And obviously the start of that was the information session with those interested ACCOs last week. Individual conversations are now commencing with some of those interested parties, and we'll continue to progress those as well. We do now have the question and answer session, but there are some questions already that I would like to kind of roll back to. And one is particularly in relation to just the increasing staffing costs that organisations are finding across the board. Obviously, the difficulty in organisations recruiting staffing, and obviously, whilst this has taken into account, I suppose, a general level of staffing costs, about how organisations are needing to pay more, I suppose, for staff in the environment that we're in, and not only that, the growing costs of fuel and transport and insurance costs and so forth, and just how that's been factored in or can be factored in.
Yeah, so look, we've made some very general assumptions around that in terms of we've used an average CPI sort of number to try to give everyone an increase in sort of the costs across the 5-year sort of term. That's not unreasonable. Yes, there will be dislocations in terms of staff, in terms of fuel, in terms of insurances over time. We expect those would average out over time, but ultimately, based on your own operating history, you'll know roughly what it costs you to have staff, to have vehicles, to have leases, and the sort of cost structures that are imposed on you by those sorts of things, and we would expect to see those coming through in your sort of pricing models going forward.
So just on insurances, there are a couple of questions regarding obviously the insurance for physical and sexual abuse cover, and the work that is currently being done around that, and what will happen, and has there been costs associated factored in with that? Obviously, where we're at the moment is that a long-term, currently the state is providing interim cover until November this year. We are currently working with all the other jurisdictions around Australia to come up with a longer-term solution. Should we need to, and a longer-term solution has not been proposed by November, that will be extended for organisations until a long-term solution is on the table. And until that long-term solution is on the table or has been suggested, it's really hard to know what the cost implications for that will be and who will pick up those cost implications as well. So it is still a bit of an unknown. At the moment, we are working hard with our colleagues in each jurisdiction to get to a point where we have something to put on the table and to look at exploring, and we will continue to do that. So, but until that time where there is an option of putting an option on the table for a longer term solution, the state will continue to interimly cover organisations. So I just wanted to, I mean, that was an insurance question that's come up a couple of times. So we might get to some of the other questions. Do you want me to keep going through, or do you guys?
Do you want me to do it? Is that easier for you?
Yeah, it's probably a bit easier for you guys to do it as well. There's probably a couple of notes that I took that I will just kind of clarify a couple of things. Ultimately, with the timeline of the commissioning process, we know that current contract arrangements finish on the 31st of December, and that we would be looking for new contracting arrangements to start at the start of next year. There will be a transitional funding phase where we will need to fund both existing contracts and new contracts for a period of time to allow, in some instances, the transition of services to occur between different organisations. This is, you know, we are talking about the care of children. We are not talking about the taking over of a workshop. So there are some real intricacies around transition that need to be taken into consideration. Intricacies and conversations that over the last couple of years have been had with the sector through the working group led by Maria Harries and Dawn Bessarab in conjunction with the department. So we're well aware of all of those transitioning issues, and it's a conversation that we will continue on with this sector through this time. And certainly, you know, we're not looking at here we go, everyone's going to finish and start on New Year's Day, you know, with all of these new care arrangements. I think, you know, the fact that we will need to do some transitioning time between new services and old services is kind of something that we have planned, we're aware of, and we're aware will need to be done. The extent to which that happens is very hard for us to plan out until the evaluation of this process has actually been undertaken. Because at the moment you don't know what you don't know, and we will, you know, we'll get to a stage where we'll be more informed as to what that looks like, and we will certainly be having those conversations with organisations as soon as we possibly can. The other couple of quick questions that I think that I can probably get to that I picked up that were earlier in the conversation was one was around we've kind of spoken about this, you and I previously, but is around the process for the reviews of NATs and how we might look at that kind of moving forward, and the process for ensuring that those are done by the start of those new contracts. You maybe want to talk a little bit to that?
Absolutely. So I addressed all of the district directors for child protection across the state, I think it was last week, and let them know how important this is to make sure we've got all of the NATs up to date by the end of May. So that's the time frame I've set for them. We may not get to 100%, but I've really asked them to do their best to prioritise getting those needs assessment tools done, so that should fall then within the middle of your tender period. So you'll have an understanding of the costs associated to the children that are currently in your care. If you're in a situation where you have children currently, you're currently funded to provide that. And I did absolutely emphasise the importance of this not being a desktop exercise. It's not a child protection worker sitting at their desk banging out a needs assessment tool. That this is something, the decisions need to be made as close to the child as possible. And so at a minimum, it needs to be a partnership. And I even encourage them to be brave and allow the sector to come up with a needs assessment tool for review by the department. That's a step for us, and we are obviously also trying to transition to a point where decision making is closer to the child. That is a shift for us. So how well we achieve that, yet to be seen, but I've certainly expressed very clearly that this needs to be at a minimum a partnership with sector agencies.
Great, thanks, 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 Amber. And the other couple, just the other question I just saw earlier in the chat as well that I noted down that I wanted to get to as well, and Michael spoke about some of this in regards to the flexibility, but there was a question around particularly the number of children for group care or for temporary for the temporary care homes, and I suppose the answer to that is really that there is some flexibility with that. So in past we have always said 4, and that's what we've kind of based ourselves on 4 children per house. But at the same time, if we've got sibling groups of 3, for example, that come in and take priority, and it's in the best interest of those children, particularly in the temporary care homes where they're there for a 3-month period of time and stability is really important for them, then options around that remaining at 3 are certainly what's going to give us some flexibility moving forward. I know that has been an ongoing issue in the past around, particularly when you've got larger sibling groups. If you've got 3 or 4 and you're wanting to keep them in the same house, we've kind of said all along that we want sibling groups to take priority, particularly, when we're talking, particularly when they're first coming into care, and I think that's really important.
Can I make a comment there too, that I think we're generally looking for that flexibility. So probably the same the other way, that if there's 5 children for a period, that would be within the flexible arrangement. So obviously no one's wanting to have a lend of anyone. So we're not expecting, if there's going to be ongoing costs, if they're looking at 5 children across the 12 months it ends up being, we understand that would come at a greater cost. But I think the ebb and flow, we're looking for that flexibility from you in the service so that we're not having to recontract every time something looks slightly different. Having to give extra funds or potentially looking at taking funds away, which we really don't do. So I'm hoping that makes sense, that we're just looking for the flexibility in those arrangements. So 4 is what we're aiming for, but with some flexibility.
Okay. So there were a few notes that I just made down a bit earlier in some of the discussion that I didn't get to. So I might hand over to Nikki now, because it's a lot easier for her to do this than me while trying to talk at the same time. Into getting to some of the questions.
I will just say that we have 84 questions currently, and they're coming in thick and fast, so we probably won't get through to everybody's questions in the time that we have.
I will say we have answered some of those 84 so far, so just to put that on the table.
And we've got those already submitted.
So, will special needs loading still be available over and above the cask?
So look, I think that's one of the factors we would need to take into account when we're looking at how we apply the CAS going forward. So yeah, we've generally tried to come up with what are the general kids sorts of needs going to look like. So, and again, the average cost sort of model, to the extent there is special needs or other complications with the need associated with the child, then we would look to make sure that they're recovered or added in through the CAS sort of model.
Has foster care recruitment being funded in this model? Has it been considered in the funding assumptions?
So I think certainly if you look at it from an agency perspective, things like foster care recruitment go to some of the administration costs that an agency would consider to be part, along with things such as finance, HR, and IT, and those other, I suppose, back end services. So let's put it into a question of, is foster care recruitment a component of the administration percentage that has been factored in as part of the analysis?
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is factored in the placement costs.
So into the placement cost amount? Yep.
Correct.
Great. Thanks, Amar.
Is there a specific amount of money out of the 130 million that will be specific for ACOs?
So this is a bit of a catch-22 question, because obviously at the moment we're going through an exploration phase with some of our Aboriginal community controlled organisations that have expressed an interest in providing services. We would like to get to a stage shortly where we're more clear about what percentage of the overall funding is being allocated to Aboriginal community controlled organisations. Until we get a better understanding from some of our interested ACO partners as to how many and across which parts of the state might be interested going forward, it's a little bit too early for us to get to that point, but certainly a point that we will be getting to. in the near future.
Currently, case support costs can be pooled by agencies for children in their care. Will the same be able to be done with the CASC funding?
Look, again, it will depend on sort of the models we're sort of seeing coming back from the sector when we go through the tender process. But again, we're not looking to completely throw out things that have worked in the past. So if you know, our sector partners think that that was a particularly good model and we wanted to keep that element of it, then we absolutely would look at it as part of the tender evaluation process.
And I think particularly if you're talking about for children who are particularly within the same group home, for example, so there might be, let's say, 3 to 4 children who are, let's just say 4 children, for example, in a group home care setting that are all NAT level 3 children, which would give you an additional CASC funding amount of around about $160,000 per house. Now, pooling that money together to provide carer support, which is one of the main aspects of that CASC, to provide for that placement would be considered appropriate. And I think, you know, particularly in those settings and where there's settings where there's multiple children within the one placement setting, then certainly the pooling of CASC you would seem to be appropriate to ensure that that placement can continue.
The ERO ended in June 2021. Shouldn't this just be included in baseline funding rather than continually being referred to for the next 5 years?
Yes, ultimately that's what we're intending to do. We're expecting that the pricing model that everyone's going to generate now reflects the current cost outcomes that they're facing. And so when we're evaluating it, we're no longer differentiating between ERO support and all the rest. We're just looking at what does the award costs look like, and how have you dealt with those appropriately through your pricing model.
We've just had a comment requesting that the questions that were submitted by Cravola be answered. So I'm not sure if we want to go through those.
If you want to start with yours, which one? Who wants to start?
Okay. So we'll start with a couple. Right. So I think one of the questions has been group home monies appear to be insufficient to meet therapeutic and award requirements. CASC, look, we've basically assumed when we built the CASC that covers that requirement. So we've put additional carer and support sort of funding into that sort of cost CASC model to deal with that sort of thing. As we've sort of said earlier in the presentation, that's more the variable cost elements associated with the individual care requirements of the child. There's been a question on special needs loading previously. So we've said special needs loading will already be factored again into the CASC funding. Even though it's an average cost sort of model we will obviously take that into account when it comes to individual children that have special needs. We've already answered the question, can the CASC be pulled across placements as allowances has been done in the past, which Mark's just dealt with. Can the CASC be used to increase carer payments where necessary? So the CASC allows for carer support funding. Therefore, how it's managed is really up to you in terms of how you build your pricing model in your bids, or ultimately when your operations, how you disperse your monies to provide the service over time. There's a question on, are the carer payments going to be fixed? So CASC is the variable component in that. So we are assuming that carer payments is a fixed element, which equates to roughly 70% odd of the funding that the service will be provided. That obviously has inflation rates and so forth, and escalation rates included in that as well. But effectively, so they're not typically 100% fixed, but ultimately there is a block funding that is essentially fixed apart from CPI across the 5-year contract period. One of the questions were, are the temporary care houses departmentally provided? What about complex care? And what about the insurance implications for NGOs? I think we've dealt with those sufficiently, Mark, already on the way through.
Yeah, look, and again, certainly when we're talking about the temporary care homes, the group care homes, and when we go into complex care as well, as we said, we've had a real mixed response from agencies in regards to the departmental provision of properties and about the CSO provision or the agency provision of properties, and those kind of discussions will continue into the negotiation phase around each of the individual contracts when they're awarded.
And I think there was a question on, has the return to country and other cultural issues been factored into the funding levels for Aboriginal placements? So again, the CASC has some prevention in there for cultural mentoring, but ultimately it depends on, that's the variable component. It's ultimately up to the service provider as to what they want to use that CASC money for. So if it's appropriate for the child to be returned back to country, we have no problems with utilising the CASC for that sort of arrangements.
And I suppose where that would be an opportunity for an individual discussion with the department would be in the care type of a temporary care home, where the child may have just come into care for a short period of time, where there is no CASC component allocated to that particular care type, around that planning being part of the connection and culture planning of children as they come into care and those initial periods into care as well.
Okay, and the question was, will there be regional allowances? And I think we've sort of dealt with all of those to date. And then I think probably the world's longest question, it feels like. The model proposed for complex care and the extreme level of needs many children have does not seem to be covered by the financial model proposed, e.g. the cost of property damage. It is questioned whether this program should be block funded for a number of reasons and due to experiences in other states with this type of modelling. So, look, I think our response to all of that is, we understand that you'll have different experiences, operational experiences in terms of provision of care across the sector. What we've tried to do is basically look at the history of the cost of operating these sorts of facilities, which we have assumed takes into account everyone's operating expenses with relation to rectification and damage, reinstating properties to operational needs, repairs and maintenance, all those sorts of activities, and then we sort of built those into our assumptions using the model going forward. Ultimately, though, you all know roughly what it costs to operate your facilities, and that's what we'd be looking to extract and evaluate as part of the tender sort of process. Again, these are assumptions that we've made as to how many places we can ultimately buy. How it actually plays out in real life will depend on the tenders that sort of come forward. And then I think the last question I've got on my magic list before I pass over to Amber is where is the evidence that the Gillian Keys report has been taken into account in the current financial models, rostering and award requirements? So look, again, we have tried to take those things into account for our assumptions. I don't think don't believe we're perfect in that sort of response. I'm not quite sure what the Keys report is recommending, but ultimately we have looked at rostering, we have looked at reward requirements in terms of how we set up our costs for the staffing components when we come up with the overall cost payments. Again, it's going to be driven by your own individual cost operating models as to what sort of price that we ultimately wind up paying.
Mark, do you maybe just want to comment on a couple of little specifics out of that report that you factored in? I know we've had some previous discussions around some of those ones, but I'm just looking at some of the other questions. We're looking for some specific examples. So I wonder if you can maybe just talk to that very briefly. Sorry to put you on the spot, but that's
fine. So what we tried to do is to take into account the Salary One report in terms of the different types of rostering. So we tried to account for that in the short-term care as well as group care. And you can see we've allowed for support work to cover breaks. We've allowed for allowances, sleeping over allowance. We've allowed for on-call. Where we haven't allowed for overtime is because of the modelling we have done indicated that there's no requirement because we've allowed for that additional support to be on hand or on deck if need be. So I think with the complex care, we have allowed for overtime. It's based on a 16+1 hour, and that has allowed for that shift work in case there's some complex requirements between the handover between the two individuals. So yeah,
thanks.
All right.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions from Cravola that I was asked to look at. And in some ways I've tried to answer them by stepping back and talking about the intention of the NAT. So the first question here is, why do children with an NDIS plan only get classified to a level 4? So remembering that the NAT is about associating funding to a child's needs. And so if a child is getting funding from somewhere else, like the NDIS, then that will mean there'll be a reduced burden for the department. But I wouldn't anticipate, like children get quite a different, there's quite a range of funding through NDIS. They might get a small amount of funding, they might get a huge amount of funding. And again, that's needs, they've got their own needs assessment tool, if you like. And so we're really trying to mirror that and do the same thing. So it's not my understanding that a child that has an NDIS plan is automatically on a level 4. It's looking again from our perspective at their needs, but the fact that they're getting support from the federal government will impact our assessment. And remembering that level 5 is really for our very, very, very complex young people that have huge costs associated to their needs. So remembering it's that cost element. This is our endeavour to be able to spread the finite bucket of money across the needs of all of the children that we have. And yeah, it's our effort to assign costs across all of our children and young people that we've got in care. So I hope that provides further clarity. So again, the next question is actually quite similar. Is the NAT an appropriate tool to assess high medical needs? The needs assessment tool doesn't assess a child's medical needs, right? A doctor does that. So we're then looking at the costs associated with the needs that have been assessed. So I'm hoping that makes sense, that the NAT is really about looking at the costs associated to those needs. It doesn't assess every need of a child. And there was another question actually around the cultural appropriateness of the NAT. But the NAT doesn't tell us about a child's culture and about their needs. We're looking at the costs associated to their needs that have been assessed in another way. So I'm hoping that I'm making that distinguishing factor really clear. The needs assessment tool is about trying to associate a child's needs to the costs. So a child might be really complex in some ways, but might not have expenses associated to those needs. So I know I probably, if I had my time over again, we'd name it something different because I think the naming of a needs assessment tool sets up expectations that in some ways aren't met by what the NAT does. It helps us assign some finances to a child's needs. So they were the questions that I had with me.
And I might just add on to that one again, and I've probably said it multiple times, but to add on to Amber's point, you guys know your businesses. You've been dealing with kids in care for years. You know what needs different types of kids have, each individual kid has. Really, it's how you distill all that into your pricing model coming forward that will determine, when we evaluate it through the tender process, the amount of funding that you're sort of getting around it. And what we're really trying to show you here is that we are trying to move our funding model to be reflective of the fact that different children have different needs and to compensate you appropriately for that going forward. We're not intending to try to cover off all eventualities because you guys know all that stuff way better than we do.
Thanks, Matt.
Happy to move back to the, will the Department of Communities operate under the same financial parameters for the out-of-home care services provided by government?
So let me just assume that the question really is, are we going to apply this model to ourselves? And look, it's a great question. It's a strategic question about how we're going to do our business. Ultimately, we would like to see the success of how this works in the contracted service provider sector, and we'll take those sorts of learnings into how we deal with the children in our care as well. This is again intended to be a model that is sort of a two-way model. So any learnings that we have from our own operations will filter into sort of this model going forward, as will any learnings that the sector has, we think will apply to our own business going forward in terms of looking after the kids. So ultimately, we want to create a system where the kids, regardless of whether they're looked after by the department or by the sector, basically have a better experience of being in care.
Is there any funding to assist in the transition to ACOs?
I mean, I think I made mention before that when we are looking at awarding contracts, you know, and when we're at that time within the commissioning process, that there will be then the discussion around what transitional costs will be involved, whether you have, you know, existing agencies that are scaling up, scaling down, whether you have new agencies coming into the space that may need some lead-in time to get to a certain stage of operation. All of those factors, as I said, will be taken into consideration. We know that there will be some transitional funding required. And again, the extent and the amount of which is very hard at this moment to articulate. However, we are aware, government is aware, that that's going to be required as we go towards the end of this process.
This probably follows on about the transition. As we move away from block funding, will we get the payments up front to enable change in cash flow and any issues in January, February 2023?
So look, again, I think it's probably a question that will be clearer once we get through the tendering cycle. I think ultimately, if I was to provide any counsel to anyone in the tendering process, is if you think there are going to be cash flow implications about when the timing of payments need to occur, then you need to call that out clearly as part of the tender. We're obviously not going to penalise anyone for wanting cash flows up front or whatever. It's really about, we understand the landscape that we're contracting into when we sign these contracts. So it's really about, you know, when you put your tender evaluation, when you put your tender together, please make sure you include everything in there that you think is going to be material about how you're going to operate that service going forward, so that we can make sure we know what we're getting into when we contract.
This is a comment. If I'm correct, this is proposing only 21 complex care arrangements. Originally, it was proposed that there would be 50 tendered. Currently, there are approximately 25 to 30, and it is already not enough. What is the thinking behind this?
I suppose, I mean, some of the ones that we've got at the moment that we would consider in the complex care end are in the specialised fostering as well. And so obviously for us within the specialised fostering, we've got some foster care arrangements where there are NAT levels 4 and 5 children who will receive the additional CASC funding as part of these new arrangements as well. So I think the complexity of some of the ones that are currently within what we would call the therapeutic high needs or the specialised fostering, actually, when it comes to them being within a placement type at a higher NAT level, it'll be the CASC funding that will really help support and provide additional funding to those placements, which will otherwise be provided through, you know, the specialised fostering. And actually, at the moment, in some cases, we'll actually provide more and additional funding that is currently being provided to some of those placements as well.
Is it realistic to expect the tender to be out in draft format in April, given the department's current staffing and focus on COVID? We need to acknowledge the impact COVID is having currently and will be having in the next month onwards. All staff are fully focused on supporting children and carers through this challenging time.
So, yeah, look, it's a fair comment, and I don't think any of us know what's going to happen over the next, 6 weeks or 2 or 3 months or even 6 months. But I guess the process is sort of the process, almost regardless of what time it's going to take. We will be flexible in terms of how we deal with it, but ultimately we do have an end point of when we need these contracts to be contracted by, and so we're going to have to make sure that we can fit within that time frame as well. So,
I'll add to that. Look, yes, you're right. COVID is a really important focus for us, but I hold responsibility for this going forward, and we've been asked in terms of our business continuity planning to look at the things that will drop off, that we will stop doing as we are impacted from a staffing perspective. And I can tell you, if I'm the only person that turns up in the office, I'll still be doing out-of-home care commissioning. So we've been very clear that this is the last thing that will drop off from the Specialist Child Protection Unit. So we are determined to see this through. We know it's been a long time coming. I think the sector wants it as much as the districts want it. So we are determined to see this through and determined to meet timeframes. And that is why also we've brought Paxson on board, because actually it's not all relying on us. So they're actually doing that draft paperwork for us. And yes, we need to look through it. And yes, we've got contracting doing that work behind the scenes already, but it is well progressed. So it's not like we're just trying to begin right now. We're well progressed, and I'm certainly determined, and the responsibility ultimately does sit with me. I'm determined to stick to those timeframes so that we can move this through and get past this transition arrangement.
When will this be communicated to existing foster carers? What happens if a child or carer does not want to transition to a new agency?
That's a really good question, and again something that, you know, when we're looking at transitional arrangements is something certainly we're gonna factor in. There will be a number of communications going out to the sector more broadly. I know there's been communications going out to peaks and yourselves as agencies, but some more broader information out to foster carers and general public, and you know, people who probably haven't been communicated so much to up to this point. But certainly as we go through and start heading into these next stages, is going to be a focus of some of our communication.
Yeah, so it's important that you're communicating with your carers as well. But ultimately, it's difficult for us to look at individual circumstances at this point in time. I do want to reassure you, though, that the best interests of the child is going to be the paramount consideration. So the Children and Community Services Act tells us that that's the overriding consideration in the way that we carry out our work. And so this is no different in the way that we transition. The best interests of the child will be paramount. And so ultimately, you might need to be working with your caseworkers and your local office in how that transitions. We're not centrally going to be in a position to look at the circumstances for every child. I anticipate that there will be a lot of transition. Yeah, there will be. So we'll certainly be supporting you with those transitional arrangements. I anticipate that we'll have Jorgen helping us as well with some transitional arrangements. And we know that that's something that we'll need to partner with you on. And some of you as agencies will continue to provide this out-of-home care. You continue to provide out-of-home care. So there may not necessarily be transitional arrangements for everyone. You might not be transitioning immediately, so you might have a consortium and you're transitioning over time. So there'll be lots of different arrangements, and we'll do our best to partner with you, with noting that the best interest of the child will be the paramount consideration as we work through it.
We have about 4 minutes left. What will be the strategy for placing children who do not fit into these models, or if there are no vacancies within the appropriate model, for example, no complex care vacancies for a complex child? Will fee-for-service placements outside of tendered services but within service agreements be considered?
I'm happy to take this on because the answer is yes, it will be considered. Ultimately, we have what we're going through, and I think this goes back to the flexibility, really. You know, we talked, and Michael talked a little bit earlier about the flexibility within contracts. So whilst we go out for a certain number of placements within each, with each of the care types, if those numbers are full and we still have a demand for further placements, the flexibility within these is to be able to scale up and scale down wherever possible. Because at the end of the day, all children need a placement. And we have a responsibility as a statutory department to ensure that that can occur. And we'll look at all the different ways we can to ensure that that can happen.
Just to add to that, what won't be happening is at district level, there will be individual negotiations with agencies around children. So that will be managed centrally. I think we've placed both the sector and ourselves in a very complex situation right now where we've got people that don't understand contracting having to negotiate contracts. So that's something that we're wanting to make sure ceases. So any fee for service will be negotiated likely through the Child and Carer Connection Hub.
Cool. I think this might be the last question. What if we ignore these models and assumptions and put our own cost model together and you take it or leave it? What if we completely ignore all these assumptions and come up with a number that you don't know what it is comprised of? Is that too radical?
No, basically, the short answer, but slightly longer answer is, look, we expect we don't expect you to be able to demonstrate every aspect of your pricing models when you're coming up with a price per placement. What we're really interested in is, yeah, be creative with your pricing, be creative with your service model. We're up for this. What we are also aware of, we need to be able to have some comparison points so we can evaluate the tenders appropriately as well. So there is going to be our framework for how we evaluate the tenders, and all of the tenders are going to have some sort of points we can connect across. But ultimately, we will ask questions if we don't understand your pricing, absolutely, so we can compare those prices with the others, people that have been bid into it. But again, it's a confidential process. You can be as creative as you like.
All right. So look, I understand that there is currently 115 published questions that we've got there. We've probably answered about 30 to 40 today. We will take those offline and come back to people with those answers, and just looking through them. Some of them are a little bit similar, so we'll take the opportunity to try and combine some of them in our answers as well and come back to you. Look, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time this afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone here on the panel for giving up their time and going through this process. We'll be back out to you with those answers. As we said, our timeline and our intent is to still have the draft tenders out in the coming weeks, which will give you an opportunity then to provide feedback. The whole purpose of providing draft documents is for feedback, and that feedback will be open for 4 weeks for you to provide that before any formal process begins. So I would really encourage everyone to take heed of some of the information that's been provided today, particularly probably that last question answered by Michael, as well as take the opportunity with the draft documents to provide that considered feedback. And if you are open to, start looking at what arrangements you as an organisation might be starting to look to put forward as part of this process. Thank you all again, and we will be...
Sorry, I just wanted to make one comment. There's a couple of people have made comments about accessing the slides. So we will make sure that we send the slides as soon as this session is finished, and then we'll take our time to get the questions and answers together so that you're not waiting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Nikki. All right, it is